Welcome back to the Wrench Factor podcast, the show that gives you an inside look at what really drives modern manufacturing and maintenance. I'm your host today, Nick Haase, co-founder of MaintainX. Today, we're going to talk about what happens when AI, automation, and digital transformation meet the real world of the plant floor. There's a lot of excitement around AI in manufacturing right now, but the hard part is not getting an impressive demo. The hard part's getting technology to work safely, reliably, and repeatedly in an environment that's filled with legacy equipment, tribal knowledge, workforce constraints, cybersecurity concerns, and operators who've seen plenty of the next big things come and go. That's why I'm excited today to welcome Vlad Romanov to the show. Vlad is a founder of Joltek, founder of SolisPLC, co-host of the Manufacturing Hub, and many other things to his name. He brings a really rare perspective across his background of electrical engineering, automation, modernization strategy, technical education, and plant floor execution, and real world execution on as an operator, in the end user in the field for years. So, Vlad, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Nick. Really appreciate it. I think the conversation is going to be very topical for many end users, OEM integrators. So appreciate you having me.
Yeah. So, Vlad, for folks who may not know you yet, give us sort of the quick version of your background, because you've got a pretty wide breadth, and yeah.
Sure. So I have over a decade of industrial automation and manufacturing experience. As you mentioned, started with fairly large end users, worked for P&G, worked for Kraft Heinz in various engineering and maintenance roles, and had the opportunity to see everything from plant floor, I would say PLCs and HMIs, all the way to MES systems, but have also dealt with CMMSs and the complexities of, making things happen on the plant floor. I then transitioned to roles with integrators, providing similar type of solutions, consulting, and advisory type of projects, if you will, for manufacturing. And so by formal education, you've mentioned this as well, electrical engineer, MBA, and currently am mostly focused on Joltek, through which I provide, again, consulting and integration services, everything from PLCs all the way up to MES systems on the architecture side, on the programming side. And of course, AI is extremely topical and comes into a lot of my conversation. So very excited to have the conversation with you today.
Love it. Yeah, you've got a really unique blend of operational experience, actual integration experience, and then through your sort of side gig of podcasting as well, you get to have all these extra conversations with folks. So super excited to chat today with you. So yeah. You've talked about AI in manufacturing becoming less of a demo problem and more of an integration problem. And so help explain what that means in practical terms to folks.
Yeah, so a lot of conversations, before any projects begin around AI are focused on what can we leverage, how do we get ROI, and it's more of a, I would say, high-level financial question, right? How do we leverage the tools that are currently available? In most cases, and again, this is just my experience with end users, they're trying to leverage the platforms that they know that are commercially available, right? So we're talking about ChatGPT, we're talking about Copilot, and a lot of times what they will do is provide access to their engineers, their operators, and whomever else access to those platforms, right? Now, the challenge with that, of course, is you're getting a lot of generalized context, right? You can ingest files, you can ingest emails, you can give it Word documents, right? And you can structure, I would say, better, let's say, like messages, maybe some general questions. On the manufacturing side, as you know, the integration side is fairly complex. So as they start asking the next question, how do we then provide context to these AI platforms from the plant floor, it becomes a lot trickier, right? And of course, you can start with, let's say, the ERP side, you can start with the plant floor, like the PLC side. And what they quickly realize is how much of a heavy lift and investment they need to make before they get there, right? And we can get into the details, but ultimately, I think that we are past the stage of we're able to just go on, again, like ChatGPT and query for just a basic, I would say, problem to how do we actually use manufacturing data and manufacturing information. And that becomes very difficult. It becomes, it requires a lot of, like I said, financial investment, but also technical knowledge to make that happen.
So what do you see? Like, where do you see the most common mistake that's being made right now by leaders in the space that are when they just go ask their teams to go do AI, go dig in?
Well, I would say that the most common mistake is exactly that, right? Just saying, let's do AI, in my experience, never works, right? And I've been in many of these conversations. What ultimately needs to happen is you need to still build business cases, just as we've done in the past, right? For many decades, someone at the end of the day will ask, if we go down the AI path, so to speak, what is it going to bring us, right? I've not heard of instances where we've been able to sell a project to a manufacturer based on the premise that you will be AI enabled, let's say, right? So number one, the mistake that I've had in many conversations on the end user side that is being made is just asking openly, what can we do with AI? I think that they need to start with business cases. And again, this could be as simple as digitizing some of our documents, right? If you walk up to, for example, an electrical panel, you should be able to pull out a paper document, let's say, of the layout. And so if you provide to your engineers and technicians on the operation side those documents that are digitized, you can then ingest them into AI and make that information queryable, right? And that's just like one example. Obviously, you can quantify for the specific use case. But again, the tangible project is we will digitize the documents, we will put that context into AI. And of course, there's some nuances, right? I'm trying to keep this brief. Is that kept on premise, that kept in the cloud, who owns the information? But ultimately, that project, for example, for a large manufacturer is worth, I don't know, $500,000 per year. Therefore, we can invest, I don't know, 2/3 or a third of that money into making that happen, right? And that's just one example of a project.
Yeah, and that resonates with sort of what we see all the time as well. Is like, it is one thing to say go use AI, but then it's another to actually be like, do we have clean, digitized asset context, standard operating procedures? You know, a team that trusts that workflow enough to use it and depend on it every day. Is super strong points. You know, one thing you've talked about that I think is going to be potentially a new subject for a lot of our audience is that you've drawn a pretty hard line between deterministic industrial automation and probabilistic AI. And so for a plant leader who's not deep in controls or maybe even deep into those terms, like explain what that distinction is and what sort of how that's manifesting maybe and showing up in their world today.
Yeah, so I mean, if we want to unpack this, right, in a traditional automation sense, if you look at standard like ISA 95, for example, you will see basically a pyramid of how the control systems are normally organized, right? You have your field device layer, then you have your PLC HMIs, you have your SCADA, you have your MES, and then you have your ERP systems. So at the bottom layer, right, your field devices to your PLCs, this is what needs to be extremely deterministic, right? And again, this could be made into a parallel. Let's say when you're driving your vehicle, right, you want it to reliably go at the speed that you're pushing the gas pedal to, right? So there's a control loop that's going to, similarly to manufacturing, that's going to say, well, Vlad is pressing the pedal this much, therefore we need to be going at the speed, right? And this is always set in stone. It should be very responsive. If there's any issues, obviously it can result in catastrophic failure. So therefore, it's and there's a lot of companies trying to figure out how do we make this more deterministic, but ultimately control systems need to be predictable as they are running the same process 24/7, 365 in the factories, right? The PLCs are extremely reliable. They're going to repeat the process. Again, it is not extremely complex from a software standpoint for that specific reason, right? It executes line 1, line 2, line 3, line 4, line 1,
The
line 2.
processes that make you money. Yeah,
Exactly. And so at the layers above that, right, when we start talking about SCADA and MES and ERP, you're starting to see the opportunity of having less deterministic type of applications, right? And so this is, to give you an example, let's say you have the control system running, you pull the data and then you query what could we improve in that control system to make it more reliable, right? And so that answer no longer impacts the control system directly. There's a human in the loop that's going to analyze the information given and then perhaps follow or not follow those recommendations, right? So that's
Makes
I would
sense.
say that's the general distinction, right? There's a lot more that goes into some of those layers, of course, but happy
Yeah.
to unpack them.
Well, so when folks are thinking about bringing AI into these processes, like what kind of decisions do you think are safe for AI to recommend today, and what kind should maybe not hit runtime without validation?
Well, so look, my general recommendation for like customers in general is you should be experimenting with AI, right?
Yeah.
If engineers and techs and whomever else is not taking at least some portion of their work week to install new tools to see what could happen, right? Again, because a lot goes into getting better at prompting AI, and that determines the level of answer you will ultimately get and how good or how bad it's going to be. But I guess to answer your
And the models are
question,
changing so fast too, right? So the models are
exactly,
getting better,
exactly.
right?
Exactly. The models are getting better, right? You're getting more context windows, so you're able to create better answers. But ultimately, I guess to answer your question more directly, at this stage, I would not, without validation, push, let's say, control system code into my systems, right?
Yeah.
But I would, for example, push dashboards. I would push, like data historian, for example, schemas without necessarily validation, because again, they are not process critical. If you send a PLC program that has been, again, not audited by an engineer, you risk, and again, obviously the risk depends on the percentage of failure of that LLM, but it
Yep.
is a non-zero risk to shutting down the system, right? How much that's going to be of a cost to the manufacturer is a separate concern, but ultimately it is not zero. When it comes to pushing new dashboards, right? So, for example, you have a control system that is already running, you have someone in quality or you have someone in maintenance that did not have access to dashboards in the past that were more operational. Well, absolutely, you can now create hooks into that PLC, right? Just reading that data, create a nice dashboard, create that application on the server. And that is, again, in my opinion, should not require that much validation, if any, in
Yeah.
this day and age. Mhm.
That makes sense. I think that's to sort of summarize that. I think like it's AI is not the job of AI today is not to run your plant. The job
Mhm.
is to maybe accelerate discovery, recommend action, surface risks, and help the broader team make better decisions while that control layer remains governed, validated, and deterministic today.
And
That should be
yeah,
our goal.
and look, and it's not to say that it cannot be used for programming even control systems. It's just to say that it needs to
Sure.
be handheld a little bit more, right? Whereas you can like one shot the dashboard and pull it up, and at worst it's going to miss a couple of views. On the
Yeah.
PLC side, you just need to be a little bit more diligent at this time, but it still saves a lot of time and effort, right? Don't get me wrong. By it cannot be not used. It can be used and it saves a lot of time. It just needs to be used a little bit differently, in my opinion, when it comes to the deterministic systems.
Love it. And
Mhm.
a lot of teams want these dashboards and predictive analytics, AI assistants, things like that, but they're still dealing with a lot of paper logs and inconsistent asset hierarchies, undocumented controls and processes.
Mhm.
For a team that's sort of still in that state, what's the practical order of operations or sequence you'd recommend to start to dig out? Where do you start?
So, look, I guess I still have a lot of, I would say, very traditional projects where I go and I assess the facility and its general readiness, right?
Yeah.
The first step, usually, that I advocate for is get all of your current assets in order, right? And what I mean by that is, well, number one, you show up and there's tons of undocumented panels. There's no network layout map. There's no cohesive set of documents, whether that's schematics or user manuals or what have you, stored in a central repository, right? So this is kind of like the very early and the very
Foundational.
basics, like exactly before you get to any conversations on AI, you need to understand your current state or baseline, right? If you will, like
Yeah.
depending on the industry you're in. Once you get there, the next step for me, usually it has been obsolescence.
Mm,
So as you want to, well, number one, let's say if you want to remote into some of those systems, if you want to pull in data from some of those assets, the reality is if they have been around for, longer than I have been on this earth, it becomes very challenging for many reasons, right? And as you can imagine, there's a level of realization when I talk to executives. They're excited about AI. We want to harvest the data. We want to store it in a historian. I show up to the plant and I have to give them the reality, right? The assets are simply too old. There's simply no way of extracting this without investing into instrumentation. And I don't know if you've ever seen this in the field, those like paper charts that you see, especially in like FDA regulated environments, right? With like a little needle that paints with ink. I talked to the executive, like, hey, I'm super excited. We want to deploy AI. Let's go check out the facility. You show up and that's what they have for data collection, right?
Yeah.
And so, of course, you have to break the bad news to them and show up with a fairly extensive bill of materials of what it would take to retrofit that equipment, right? So that's kind of like step number 2. We need to make sure that everything is, again, not in a general sense, like modernized for the sense of modernizing, but to be able to put those assets on the network, extract data, start storing that in the database. Probably second step in my conversations.
I think that's super important, and it's sometimes easy to want to get ahead of things, but if you don't have that right contextual layer and that foundation, it just you're going to set yourself up for failure. And I want to touch on something else with you that I think you've got a pretty unique perspective on, which is, if you've talked about the importance of solving for the skeptical long tenure operator. You've worked with a few of those in your day. The person who's run the line for 25 years doesn't need a dashboard, or he doesn't think he needs a dashboard telling him how to do their job. What is your advice, and what have you seen work well to get some of those folks on board? Because I've seen some people who maybe are doing some of the right steps that you talked about already, and there's they're moving things along, but they're really worried about getting buy-in and adoption from the actual front lines. What's your kind of advice on that?
It is very challenging, right? Like the human factor in manufacturing is very real. I would say that as an engineer early in my career, I still remember how I was always focused on the technical aspects, right? You're excited about the greatest, latest and greatest thing, and you want to deploy that because you believe that it's going to give the tools necessary to everyone at the plant. But very quickly, as you mentioned, you start to realize that it's not the only thing that matters. I would say, number one, getting the people involved as early as possible, right? And asking for feedback. And obviously, you and I can have a discussion as to how much that feedback is actually implemented in the tool, and how it is implemented is going to be on a case-by-case basis, right? But I think just getting the people excited about the solution that will hopefully help them solve some of those problems is extremely important, right? And for me, as I progressed through my career, I started thinking of it less as we're going to bring that solution to them, as we need to almost find this Venn diagram, right? Like where the intersection is, like they want something, here's the tool, like where do we find that intersection that makes sense even for the operator, right? Because if there is no, even the smallest win for the operator, and that could be even, they need to press a sequence of like 6 buttons to make something easier, you implement that as a software as a single button, then they see, oh wow, like they're paying attention to what I need, so let me try and put in some effort into learning the entire solution, right? And that's just one example. But I guess to go back to your question, getting them involved very early in the process, asking for feedback, and see it more as an iterative approach than we're going to deploy this and we're going to walk away, right? And whether or not all of my projects have gone that route is, of course, a separate discussion. But that is how I recommend a lot of my customers to do it today.
Yeah, I've seen it done both ways, and I think you're spot on that that's the part that leaders sometimes miss, particularly on projects that aren't as successful as they'd like them to be, is that adoption's not something that should be a communications plan after the fact. It's something you design into the workflow from the beginning, and it really helps get people feel like they're part of the process instead of something that the process is happening to, and gives them more time to digest what's going on, and
yeah
that sort of thing. So
and look, it's part of the, like, nobody, in my opinion, nobody wants to pay for training, right? Like the reality is capital to fund training post project is very difficult, right?
Yep.
But the reality is, right, and like I said, I had to learn this the hard way throughout my career, is that not everyone's going to catch on to the latest and greatest software as fast as some of the others, right? So sometimes you need to spend that extra time to explain the platform, not only to the manager, but then to the supervisor, to the operator, walk them through specific screens. And sometimes you have to do it more than once. And like I said, I've been on projects where we would walk away again because of lack of funds, let's put it that way. And there was confidence that anyone can understand the software, this tool, and it should bring, X amount of savings. And then we go through cycles of realizations, like we maybe should have invested a bit more time in that, like post deployment cycle, to make sure that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah. I think that's a great call out. And as I think about this, like, as someone who spends, you've got a lot of time that you work on your education side with one of your businesses there, with both educating engineers, technicians. As automation's changing right now, what skills do you think the next generation should prioritize or spend a little more time looking into, even if maybe it's not something that's widely adopted or used in their operations today, if they want to stay ahead of the trend?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, right? I've always been a strong proponent of, you need to understand what's been done in the past so that you could walk into and make changes into the future, right? And what I typically mean by that is, again, I've entered the industry in 2014. I still see controllers on the plant floor that one needs to install DOS to program. You know what I mean? And
Right.
that's just the reality and the nature of the industrial space. I think that slowly but surely there are changes being made, right? And if you look at any vendor of PLCs or HMIs or SCADA platforms, they are implementing AI, they are implementing, I would say, more advanced algorithms. But the install base and the reality of the plant floor is such that there's still a ton of very old equipment. So I would say, at least for the time being, I think you still need a strong foundation on the software and hardware side, on the very traditional sense. But of course, I would expect if someone is enrolled in a program at a university or college level, they would be playing around with the tools alongside of these older systems and figuring out what is going to make more sense for the employer of the future, because these migrations are happening, the new tools are being utilized. Right. And so it's kind of I guess we're in a shift right now where you kind of need to know both, right? Is what I'm trying to say. I don't think you have the luxury to just forget about what's currently deployed, nor do I think that you need to like focus on one or the other, if that makes sense.
Makes total sense. Like, I think you're spot on. The best automation people they can't be tool experts today or just specific around something new. They've got to, if you don't understand the process, the people, the constraints, and the business outcome, and really, understand where things come from. Because how many plants out there are running on 100%, brand new automation technology? Not very many. And I think the more valuable skills are going to be the ones that can maybe help take that transit, work with a plant mid transition, or even bring them from 0 to 1. So it's a great reminder that even with all the shiny tools we have, you got to know the basics, know where you come from.
Yeah, look, a very brief maybe side story. We just closed off Automate out of Chicago, and I had prepared a demo with some components of SCADA and MES, and basically data analytics that can be leveraged for AI purposes. And to my surprise, a lot of the individuals that I spoke with throughout the week, right outside of the presentations and the keynotes, were not around AI. They were more around, we have these very old control systems. We're talking, PLC 5s, we're talking Data Highway Plus, DeviceNet, right? So basically protocols that have been obsolete for many, many years, if not decades. And they're trying to figure out, how do we migrate off those platforms onto newer solutions? But I guess to your previous question, right, the skill set required there is understanding the systems, But again, pairing that with, I think you can accelerate some of those transitions using now AI, right? Like, so you can extract code, you can make the transfers a lot easier. The engineer that's going to win is not going to be the one who will learn, the brute force conversion. It's going to be the one that leverages AI paired with the technologies and can make those translations a lot faster.
Love it. I want to try something new with you today on our wrench factor to do a quick lightning round. So if you're up for it, let's dig in.
Let's do it.
All right. So what's the most overhyped manufacturing technology right now?
I think it's still Industry 4.0, Industry 5.0, right? I think that we have gotten into this idea that data is extremely important and needs to be leveraged from the plant floor and field operations. I think no one can clearly define what the architecture looks like. I still believe a lot of manufacturers are stuck in, let's call it Industry 2.0 and 3.0. And the reality is they need a ton of help to make the transition.
Love it. That's a good hot take right there. What's the biggest AI myth in manufacturing?
Biggest AI myth. Look, there's many companies attempting to do this, but I don't think that AI-based like control systems, right, like we've discussed a little bit earlier, is feasible at this stage. I think that there's a ton of content being pushed into that segment. I am extremely skeptical, again, for the reasons that we've discussed, because there is simply no determinism yet for control systems. So I think that is still a myth. Whether that's going to come in the years to come, I'm open to being proven wrong, but I think it is simply not feasible today.
Awesome. What's one KPI every plant leader should understand better?
I know this is a bit controversial in especially the LinkedIn circles. For me, OEE is still a very critical metric. A lot of decisions need to be made based on OEE, and until you know the basics of OEE for your specific plant, for your production lines, it becomes very difficult to have conversations about any topic that you and I have discussed, Nick. If we're making improvements, if we're troubleshooting, if there is any positive impact, right, on our lines, as like when we've rolled out some of these tools, if you don't know your OEE and you're not able to track it over time, regardless of the definition, right? There's also several definitions and people have their own take on what OEE needs to be. Yeah. As long as you pick one and you stick to it and you have a timeline for your own operations, I think that's the most important KPI.
Yeah, I agree. I think I've counseled many leaders that's if they can't get a handle on that number, that can oftentimes be part of your business cases that we need to know what that is.
Yep.
What's one thing you wish executives would stop saying about digital transformation?
About digital transformation specifically. Interesting. I think it's going back to the comment I made a little bit earlier, right? But digital transformation sometimes is still seen as a project as opposed to a long-term partnership, right? So when I go into some of the conversations, I wish that we do not have a finite set of, again, like time frame for digital transformation. I have yet to see a group that can come in, do a very thorough assessment, recommend everything from A to Z, and get it all done in one fell swoop. I think that it is much more a relationship between an integrator and an end user, and of course distributor on the back end as well. But it is something that needs to be ongoing. We start with a small project and we move on to something a little bit bigger, until the point that we are happy with the results. So I guess to summarize, it is, yes. And look, it's a bit, I would say, like corny to say that it's a journey, but I've learned, again, like even in my early days at P&G, right, when you invite a consultant or integrator over, you don't want to give them the largest project because, again, there is risk involved, right? You want to give them something small, then you go into something a little bit larger, you figure out their skill sets. Exactly. I think that's the way to go. And like I said, I sometimes get into conversations on digital transformation where it's a project. And to me, it's still a little bit frustrating, so to speak.
Awesome. We'll close it out on a high note here. What's one thing makes you optimistic about manufacturing in 2026?
I think that things will only continue to improve, whether that's a result of utilizing more AI, whether that's some of the reshoring initiatives that we continue to hear about. I think that things are only getting better, right? There's always the doom and gloom side of you, but I think that we're getting cheaper components, we're getting better robotics. There's a lot of investments going into humanoids, and whether you agree that they're like there or not there yet, I think it benefits and uplifts the industry as a whole. I think it gives manufacturing access, like I said, to basically more affordable hardware, which means that the small to medium businesses are going to elevate as well. And I think it's going to push the industry forward. So I am very optimistic about manufacturing in a broader sense. I think there's good changes coming.
Awesome. Well, Vlad, this was a fun conversation. I think the big takeaway here, is AI and automation can absolutely change your manufacturing, the reality of manufacturing in your floors today, but only if your leaders are respecting the reality of the plant floor. And the winners are going to be the teams that build the foundation, earn operator trust, and validate before they automate and connect technology to measurable operational outcomes. So huge thanks 100%. For joining us. And for everyone watching, make sure to follow Vlad, Joltek, SolisPLC, Manufacturing Hub for more practical conversations on manufacturing modernization, industrial automation, and workforce development. We'll put the links in the show notes here for you guys. And the Wrench Factor is live every other week. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see y'all next time. Thanks again, Vlad.
Thanks for having me, Nick. Really appreciate it.